in the other situation that we're often talking about in Gaza, when there are strikes, there have been strikes that have hit hospitals, other facilities, universities. In those cases, and in some cases, U.S. weapons are actually involved in those strikes. But you've been pretty unable in a lot of those cases to say definitively what happened. Why the disparity there about your sort of information gathering?
Rafah is completely destroyed, and people are dying. Israel is just grabbing land in the West Bank. It's really doing a lot of things. Would you be agreeable to any other state doing what Israel has done, let's say, in the past 48 hours, or the past 72 hours, or the past week, and so on, against Palestinians, whether in Gaza or in the West Bank? I mean, wouldn't you be outraged? I mean, we hear reports by Israeli soldiers themselves. They're saying they were killing children because they were bored.
I know Kirby was asked about this a little bit, but more indirectly, the attack today, or the explosion at the hospital, the children's hospital. Could you say anything about that? I believe Zelensky has declared a day of mourning. The Russians are saying that they think that it was Ukrainian air defense systems. Are you sure that this was a Russian attack? And if so, do you have any comment on
Yes, we are sure it was a Russian attack. We've seen Russia unleash another savage missile attack hitting civilians in Kyiv and other cities across Ukraine. We are seeing reports that at least 23 civilians were killed in Ukraine in these missiles attacks. Just to be clear, these are sites that serve no military purpose. They're not sheltering Ukrainian military assets. They're not sheltering members of the Ukrainian military. These are civilian infrastructure, pure and simple, that cannot, should not, must not be targets of military attacks. But once again, we've seen Putin deliberately attacking civilian infrastructure as part of his bloody war against Ukraine.
And so you think it's deliberate? I mean, I guess you can't get in his head, but you think it's deliberate? It wasn't a mistaken target?
So it's hard to say with any one particular strike, but when you look at the history of Russia continuously targeting civilian infrastructure that bears no legitimate military purpose, then it's hard to conclude it's anything but deliberate. This isn't just one strike. There is a pattern of strikes, as I said, where there are no Ukrainian forces, there are no Ukrainian military assets, and yet you see the Russian military continue to strike them time after time.
Could I follow up on Ukraine and some of the diplomacy? Yeah. The Hungarian prime minister was recently in Kyiv and Moscow and Beijing. Do you find anything productive about this? What's your take on it?
No, not at all. We find it concerning, in fact. Look, before he traveled to Russia, you did see the Hungarian prime minister travel to Ukraine. We thought that was an important thing for him to do. We thought that was a productive step. And we would welcome, of course, actual diplomacy with Russia to make it clear to Russia that they need to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, that they need to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. But that is not at all what this visit appears to have been.
Could I follow up on one more? There's another visitor in Moscow today, Prime Minister Modi of India. Obviously India has a long-standing relationship with Russia. What do you think of the timing of this right before the NATO summit and in light of what's going on?
Yeah, so again, we did just see Modi, like Orban, meet with President Zelensky. We thought that was an important step to take. And we would urge India, as we do any country when it engages with Russia, to make clear that any resolution to the conflict in Ukraine needs to be one that respects the UN Charter, that respects Ukraine's territorial integrity, Ukraine's sovereignty. And, India is a strategic partner with whom we engage in a full and frank dialogue, and that includes on our concerns about the relationship with Russia.
I don't understand your answer to the Orban question. I mean, it's okay and it's good and productive for him to go to see Zelensky in Kyiv, but it's concerning and bad that he goes to Putin. Is it only the timing?
No.
Because there are plenty of people who have been going.
If you listen to the answer to my full answer, it's we welcome people engaging with Russia about the war in Ukraine if they make clear to Russia that Russia needs to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. And that goes to the fact that there is a difference between Ukraine and Russia, and there's a difference between engaging with Ukraine and Russia because one side is the aggressor and one side's the victim. So, of course, we look at their engagement with those two countries differently.
Well, yeah, but okay, so do you know for sure that he didn't? make those things clear?
We have seen no indication that is, including his public statements, that is
And do you think
what he's
that
making
Prime
clear.
Minister Modi made clear to President Putin?
As I just said,
Do you think that President Erdogan has made clear?
So I will look to Prime Minister Modi's public remarks to see what he talked about. But as I said, we made quite clear directly with India our concerns about their relationship with Russia, and so we would hope India and any other country, when they engage with Russia, would make clear that Russia should respect the UN Charter, should respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
And what's the problem with Orban going to see Xi?
I wasn't asked about that. I was
Well,
asked about.
I think
I was
you-
asked about. I was asked
You
about.
were asked about that.
Oh,
and you said it was
I missed
concerning.
I missed that part of the question.
No,
I was.
wasn't that part of your question?
Yeah, I was asking.
I didn't. I totally missed the sheep part I was talking about.
So there's no. So you don't have a problem with.
I
him
don't have any
meeting
comment.
Xi?
We understand that countries
Okay.
engage with China. We, as you know, Secretary Blinken has traveled to China twice now
Yes.
with President Xi.
Just follow up briefly on the Modi part of that. You said that that the U.S. has dialogue with India about concerns about the relationship with Russia. Were the concerns expressed prior to Modi's visit, and has there been any dialogue before that?
We have long made clear those concerns.
I mean, specifically about the trip to Moscow.
I'm not aware of any conversations specifically about this trip in advance of the trip.
Just while we're on the topic of Russia, are you expecting any other provocative actions from Russia this week, given the 75th anniversary of NATO, the gathering in Washington this week?
You know, it's very hard to say because it's not like this strike against civilian infrastructure today came out of the blue. It's not like this is the first time that they have done this. So it's hard to know whether this strike was timed to the NATO summit or not, because we've seen strikes from Russia against civilian infrastructure that have killed scores of civilians in previous weeks. So I don't know how to answer that question other than that this fits a pattern that we have seen from Russia going back to the outset of this conflict. So I certainly expect that these sorts of strikes would continue. Whether or not they will come this week, whether or not they're related to the NATO summit, I think it's impossible to say.
And any indication that there's plans for a change to their nuclear posture or their nuclear doctrine this week?
No, we have seen no indications of that.
Okay. And if we could just stick on NATO for a minute here. Kirby said, Ukraine is in NATO's future, or whatever way it was. And I wonder if it's still the position, though, of this administration that the war has to be over before Ukraine can join NATO. Otherwise, that would draw the entire alliance into the conflict.
So I just don't want to get too much into the details of what Ukraine's membership in NATO will look like and what steps they have to take to get there. Today, in advance of significant new announcements being made in that regard over the course of this week. So I know that sounds a little bit like a punt, but in fact, it's because we will be making new announcements with respect to these very questions this week, and I don't think I should get ahead of them today.
There are specific announcements you're going to make having to do with the timing of the war and when Ukraine will join NATO?
About their bridge to NATO, and I don't want to talk about it any further before we can make those announcements, and you can all look at them, and then, of course, we'll be happy to take questions about them and talk about them further.
And then last question on NATO. On Wednesday night, there is the leader-level dinner that is being hosted by the president and the first lady. It starts at 6 p.m. Over the weekend, President Biden told governors who had gathered that he's not going to go to any events after 8 p.m., try and get some rest, given some of his challenges with his age. So is there a plan for the Secretary of State to stay if that event goes on longer past 8 p.m., or will the president stay on past 8 p.m.?
So I won't speak to the president's schedule. I'll let the White House do that. But I would say with respect to his schedule, I think this NATO summit will look a lot like previous NATO summits where the president and other members of our government, the Secretary of State, but also the Secretary of Defense and other leaders in the government will have a full schedule of events starting in the morning and going through the evening. That includes bilateral meetings, includes multilateral meetings. The Secretary will participate in those. With respect to any one event, several days from now, I can't tell you what his participation will be at that dinner, and when it comes to the president, the White House can speak to that.
Well, to be fair, the Vilnius summit, it was the secretary who went to that dinner instead of the president.
Right, but with this one, I'm going to let the White House speak to what the president's exact schedule is. I just don't know here. Yeah.
Just to follow up on the comments you gave about this strike in Kyiv in the hospital. Obviously, this has happened very quick, only a few hours ago. Could you talk us through how you're able to come to those kind of solid conclusions about, this is a Russian attack. We've seen this pattern. We see it fits the pattern. In this case, what is the process for you to be able to sort of state with so much kind of confidence what's happening?
Well, so I could get into our ability to look at missiles that are launched. I could get into the Ukrainian military's ability to look at missiles that are launched and talk about that with respect to any one strike. But also, give me a break. There's no one else lobbing missiles at Ukraine right now.
Right.
There's no one else launching attacks at Ukraine. So I think it's pretty clear that it came from Russia.
But you probably can guess what I'm getting at is, in the other situation that we're often talking about in Gaza, when there are strikes, there have been strikes that have hit hospitals, other facilities, universities. In those cases, and in some cases, U.S. weapons are actually involved in those strikes. But you've been pretty unable in a lot of those cases to say definitively what happened. Why the disparity there about your sort of information gathering?
So the disparity is in the context of the events, and I'll give you just a couple of examples when it comes to Gaza. What makes these types of assessments so hard? Oftentimes, it is clear that a strike on any one target was an Israeli strike. If it's an airstrike, for example, it's clear that it was an Israeli strike. It's not from anyone else. Sometimes there are other attacks where there's an exchange of fire between Hamas and the IDF, and it's clear, or it's unclear, I should say, when one specific site was damaged, whether that damage was from IDF munitions, Hamas munitions, or both, which sometimes happens in a crossfire. That's one way in which it's difficult. The other way in which it's difficult is understanding what the actual target was. And so that's one of the things that's different when you look at Russia's strikes on Ukraine. The Ukrainian military doesn't hide behind civilians. It's not headquartering itself in hospitals, under hospitals, in other civilian sites, in apartment buildings. And that's exactly what we see Hamas do. And so when you get to making assessments about strikes in Gaza, it's not just always who conducted the strike, but whether the strike ultimately was after a legitimate military target or not. And it's a much different assessment in Gaza, where you have Hamas using civilians as human shields, which is not at all the case in Ukraine.
Right, but you did sort of say that it seems that this isn't an accidental strike aimed at something else. That's quite, there's quite a lot of information that you're able to sort of pass on there. There have been cases where, I'm obviously not defending the Russian strikes, but there are cases where Ukrainian anti-aircraft fire has taken down a missile and it hits something, right? There is complexity to that, but you're able to, a few hours later, give a pretty detailed account of what happened. I'm not saying I'll give you a break on that. That's your job. But on the Israeli case, often, we're left with after months, you haven't come up with a real conclusion about what happened in a certain specific incident. That and these are U.S. weapons that are being used. You have the ability to sort of demand answers from the country involved. So I think people will watch this and think, there's a disparity here, and I'm wondering, is there not a difference in the way that you're approaching these and giving the benefit of the doubt to one side?
There is no difference in how we are approaching these. There's a difference in the context. There's a difference in the conflict, and that's what leads to our inability sometimes to give such definitive answers. I will also say that there is a difference in assessing responsibility for a strike, right, which is what I was getting into a moment ago, and assessing whether the strike was a legitimate military target. Those are two entirely separate things. Sometimes you can make an assessment about who carried out the strike, but you can't know unless you were on the ground whether it was a legitimate military target. And that's especially the case where we often see conflicting claims in Gaza, which is not the case in Ukraine. I haven't heard any conflicting claims about what happened in Ukraine and what Russia might have been trying to hit if it was not this hospital, if it was not the other civilian infrastructure that they have hit. And I've seen no claims from Russia that there were legitimate military targets embedded in this civilian infrastructure. That is often the case in Gaza, where you get conflicting claims, where you have reports from the ground that there were no Hamas fighters there, and you have the IDF claiming that it took out a number of Hamas fighters. When you have those conflicting claims, that often makes it hard to offer definitive conclusions for what I would hope are fairly obvious reasons.
Can I say on Gaza?
I'll go to Saeed first. I'll come to you.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you first if you read or heard about the Haaretz report on Israel employing the Hannibal directive on October 7th.
So I did see that report that moved over the weekend, and that's the limit of my knowledge of seeing that report from Haaretz.
Does that make you change your position or your perspective on what really happened that day, that the Israelis may be responsible for killing a majority of the people that died on that day?
Boy, it certainly does not, Saeed. I don't think there's any question. I don't think there's any question that it was Hamas. Just let me finish. I don't think it's any question it's Hamas that is responsible for the overwhelming number of deaths on October 7th.
All right. Now, you in your answer to Simon, you gave two answers. You were saying that, almost with certainty that people were killed in the crossfire. Do you have any figure on how many people got killed in the crossfire?
No.
Or how many people that died as a result of direct Israeli attacks?
No, I don't. But that's exactly my point, Saeed. I'll give you the best example of this is the recent hostage rescue when a number of people in the area who were not members of Hamas were killed in crossfire. And that happened when Israeli vehicles with a hostage on board were leaving the area, took fire from Hamas, and then there was exchange of fire. And that's something that happens from time to time.
300 people died that day. But at any rate, so let me ask you, what is the status of the negotiation now? Is there a ceasefire in Gaza's future?
We certainly hope there's a ceasefire in Gaza's future, and we are trying incredibly hard to achieve a ceasefire. The negotiations are ongoing. The CI director is in Cairo today working on those negotiations. As we said last week when we received a response from Hamas, we found reasons to be hopeful in that response. But that said, we don't yet have a deal, and we're not taking anything in granted unless and until we get a deal. And so we continue to work to try to achieve a ceasefire that would secure the release of hostages, would allow us to surge humanitarian assistance in and alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian people.
So you believe that the Israeli Prime Minister is okay with this new proposal?
He has said he is, yes.
Okay.
Let me just be correct. I want to make sure I'm not misunderstood. I don't mean that in that he has endorsed the proposal that has come back from Hamas. He has endorsed the proposal that the Israeli government put forward, and we're working to bridge the differences between Hamas's response and what the Israeli government put forward sometime before, several weeks ago.
You think this is a bridge too far?
I'm not going to negotiate on this in public.
All right. Let me ask you a couple of things. We see Israel, Rafah is completely destroyed, and people are dying. Israel is just grabbing land on the West Bank. It's really doing a lot of things. Would you be agreeable to any other state doing what Israel has done, let's say, in the past 48 hours, or the past 72 hours, or the past week, and so on, against Palestinians, whether in Gaza or in the West Bank? Wouldn't you be outraged? And we hear reports by Israeli soldiers themselves. They're saying they were killing children because they were bored.
So
out loud.
Let me take those one at a time. When it comes to abuses by the IDF, we make very clear that we expect the IDF to have full accountability for any soldier that behaves inappropriately, that violates either IDF rules of engagement or the laws of war. And we have seen the IDF announce that they will take steps to impose such accountability, and we will be watching that very closely. When it comes to settlements, we have also made clear that we oppose the advancement of settlements in the West Bank. We think that they are both inconsistent with international law and that they are ultimately counterproductive to the realization of peace, which is in Israel's interest. And that includes urging Israeli officials to not take actions to fund outposts that have long been illegal under Israeli law. So we will continue to make that clear.
So any particular response to what happened last week in terms of the size of land confiscated by Israel for settlement purposes, which is apparently the largest since the 1967 war, and definitely since the Oslo Accord in 1993. Have any particular comment on that?
Yeah, as I just said, we oppose the advancement of settlements. We oppose them taking actions to fund outposts. We think all of those are illegal under international law and ultimately hurt the chances of peace.
Can I just follow up on that point that Saeed was making about ceasefire? Because there was a list of principles the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, his office issued yesterday, on the ceasefire, one of which appeared to be a desire, or he said, insisting on resuming fighting until all the objectives of the war have been achieved. I mean, we know that one of his objectives is the complete destruction of Hamas, not just its military existence, but also its administrative governance capabilities and so on, which goes way beyond what the president announced in his May framework that was described as the Israeli proposal. So have you got any reaction to what he said yesterday?
So I don't know that this will be a satisfying answer, but I think it's most productive to hold these negotiations in private, not in public.
But it wasn't. The president made a very public announcement about.
Just hold on. Just let me finish, Tom. I'm happy to answer the question. You can ask me a follow-up if you want. We think it is productive to have these conversations in private, not in public. Sometimes seeing the Israeli government make public statements. We've seen Hamas make public statements. We're going to hold the negotiations in private. And what has not changed is Israel is in its conversations with us saying that they are committed to the proposal that the president publicly outlined.
The reason I was pushing back on that is it was a very public announcement by the president about, in some detail, about what should be in this proposal, and we have a very public announcement by the Israeli Prime Minister about what he believes. So this isn't, I'm not asking you to negotiate in public, I'm just asking for whether you believe this is a shift in the Israeli position, or is this something that Mr. Netanyahu is simply saying for
We do not believe that their substantive position has changed. They have consistently supported the proposal that they put forward several weeks ago that the president outlined publicly.
So do you think he's saying this for domestic consumption and he doesn't actually mean it?
I'm just not going to characterize it at all.
On Gaza?
Yeah, go ahead. I promise you.
The United Nations warned of widespread starvation in Gaza all the way back in December. We've had aid organizations and relief groups who've said over and over again that Israel is using starvation as a tactic of war. You've had 12 US government employees who've resigned, and they accuse the US government of undeniable complicity in the starvation of Palestinians. Doctors we've spoken to at Al Jazeera have told us that they, in part, also blame the US government for the horrors that they are seeing. How do you respond to the allegations of complicity of the US government, and what more will it take for the US to stop Israeli military funding?
So let me just take the humanitarian assistance piece first, because you raised that in the introduction to your question. So is the United States that has secured all of the major agreements to get more humanitarian assistance into Gaza, going back to the very early days, the first week after October 7th, when the secretary traveled to the region and the president traveled to Israel, and together convinced Israel to open Rafah crossing to allow humanitarian assistance in. It is the United States that worked to open Kerem Shalom to get humanitarian assistance in, to open Erez Gate in the north. It is the United States that has worked day and night in the region, in Washington, in other capitals around the world, to coordinate a humanitarian assistance effort to get food and water and medicine to the Palestinian people. It has not been enough. There are obstacles. Sometimes those are logistical obstacles coming from Israel. Sometimes those are the nature of moving humanitarian assistance around in an armed conflict. But when you look at what has actually happened, the sad truth is there is widespread food insecurity in Gaza, and we have worked to try and address that. But when you saw the IPC, the group that actually measures famine, come out and make assessments, they warned that famine was imminent. We worked hard to get gates open and get more humanitarian assistance in. In their last assessment, which came out after the time they predicted famine was going to occur, they came out and assessed that it had not yet happened, which is not at all to say that the conditions are good. Of course they're not. They remain dire for the population in Gaza. But we continue to work to get humanitarian assistance in, and will continue to do so. I cannot tell you the amount of work that the secretary has put into this, that the president has put into this, that others in the government have put into this, and will continue to put into it. And that's not to mention the ceasefire agreement that we are trying to broker, which would allow a massive surge in humanitarian assistance and would allow humanitarian assistance to move more freely around Gaza. So when it comes to our policy for getting humanitarian assistance into Gaza and to the people who need it, we're not going to change one bit. We're going to continue. Oh, no, just let me finish. We're going to continue to work day and night to get humanitarian assistance, and recognizing all the barriers, working to try to overcome them. And every time we do, something else pops up and we work to overcome that too. And that's what we're going to continue to do.
So just follow up on that, but the latest IPC report actually says that 96% of the population of Gaza is facing acute food insecurity,
which is what I just
crisis
said,
level or
absolute
higher.
dire. Yeah.
So it's still very dire, and you've spoken about what the US has done, but the US also continues to be the biggest funder of Israeli military, and under US law, it is required that any country receiving military support must not obstruct the flow of humanitarian aid during war. And every major rights group, from the United Nations to Human Rights Watch, has said that Israel is using starvation as a tactic of war. Do you disagree with them?
So
And are you, just sorry, one final question, are you not afraid of completely losing legitimacy?
So let me just answer
being
the
hypocritical when it comes to supporting human rights in one country,
let me just
but
answer,
not when it comes to Palestinians.
Let me just answer the first question. So I would encourage you to read the report that we issued on this very question 2 months ago that looked into Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law and their work and whether they had done a good enough job to let humanitarian assistance in, where we said that there were some roadblocks that needed to be overcome, and we had worked to overcome those, and we had seen Israel take steps to allow humanitarian assistance in. At times they have been too slow. At times they haven't moved quickly enough. At times there have been barriers that we needed to break down, but we have worked to do it, and we have seen Israel take steps to allow humanitarian assistance in. Now, there is, as I just said a moment ago, there is always something more that needs to be done. We've talked about the fact that you have a lot of assistance coming to Kerem Shalom now, but it can't move around Gaza as freely as it could because of looting by armed gangs. And so we need to come up with practical steps to address that. And I say that to get at the point that I know sometimes everyone likes to make this seem like a black and white issue that is completely simple, where there's somebody that's blocking humanitarian assistance, when it can be much more complex. There can be other problems, such as the looting of criminal gangs, that we have to assess, and so we're working with our partners in the region to try to assess that, and we're going to continue to.
I have to reply to that. Sorry, I just have to quickly reply to that. Sorry, can I just quickly reply to that point?
For this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted in accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure. I invite the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza pursuant to Security Council Resolution 2720, Madam Sigrid Kaag, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. And I would now like to give the floor to Madam Sigrid Kaag.
Mr. President, Excellencies, nearly 9 months have passed since the horrific terror attack by Hamas against Israel on the 7th of October. The scars of that day run deep. The pain of the hostages, the torment for their families, is a constant reminder to the Israeli people and political life. During this same period, Palestinian civilians in Gaza have been plunged into an abyss of suffering. Their homes lie shattered, their lives upended. The war has not merely created the most profound of humanitarian crises, it has unleashed a maelstrom of human misery. The public health system, as you know, has collapsed, schools destroyed, and the disrupted education system threatens acutely future generations. With summer temperatures soaring and severe shortages of basic services such as waste management, sanitation facilities and water supplies, the spectre of outbreaks of infectious and communicable diseases looms large. Following the Israeli offenses against Rafah since the 6th of May, over 1 million people have been displaced once again, desperately seeking shelter and safety. 1.9 million people are now displaced across Gaza, and I'm deeply concerned about reports of new evacuation orders issued into the area of Khan Yunis. Its impact on the civilian population is deep. In Gaza, nowhere is safe. Behind every statistic, Mr. President, is a human story of hope, dignity and aspirations. And in my visits to Gaza, I am met with voices that echo a single heart-wrenching question.